Welcome to the IDPro Show, where we're chatting with the movers, the shakers, and the accidental identity makers of the digital identity world. I'm Heather Flanagan, Executive Director of IDPro and Principal Editor for the IDPro Body of Knowledge.
I'm Chris Cochran from AK Identity, where we introduce you to the world of expert insights and in-depth discussions within the world of identity. Whether you're an identity vet or you're just learning about the world of identity, this show is your gateway to the latest trends, knowledge, and career advice.
So this week, we are thrilled to have Hirsch Singhal with us. I've known Hirsch for a while, one of my favorite people, and he is the staff product manager for identity at GitHub, where he's busy making sure that the developers don't, accidentally lock themselves out of their own code, which I know has never happened to you personally, but suffice to say, it does happen. Before GitHub, he wrangled identity protocols for Entra, also known as Azure AD, learned the ropes from legends like Mike Jones and Vittorio Bertocci. Hirsch describes his entry into the identity fields as he kind of tricked himself into it, first building auth solutions for a Windows web server dev tool, and later diving into the deep end with Azure AD. But along the way, he discovered there's a whole other side to identity, and that's authorization, or as he put it, the part that he completely missed until he got to GitHub. So his journey is equal parts learn as you go and teach while you're learning, which is a vibe I absolutely appreciate. So get ready to hear about identity hydras, facepalm moments, and how to build a career in this wild and wonderful industry. Hirsch, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, you tricked yourself into identity. Well, what was the trap? And would you say it was a genius moment or utter madness?
Looking back on it, utter madness. I don't know what I thought I was going to accomplish. It's certainly on the level of I wouldn't attempt it today. So we owned a web server that was built into Windows. I was on the Windows developer experience team. So if you were building an app and you wanted to deploy it from Visual Studio to, say, an Xbox or a HoloLens, that was my team. So we've got this web server that is running on a random local device. And we need you to sign into it. Obviously, we don't want any random person to sign into it. But we'd also like that to be over HTTPS. But it's a local device. It doesn't have a cert. It doesn't even have a DNS name. And so went all the way down into the rabbit hole of, I'm blanking on the names at this point, even because they're not a thing, is what I would say. But like, how do we get HTTPS working in a way that we can trust without having to approve certificates that you don't trust, well, so that you can send over a username and password ultimately. And along the way, I got to work with the Microsoft identity team a little bit, where they said, no, we can't help you with this. And got so far actually as to come up with these harebrained schemes, getting a patent out of it that obviously went nowhere. But it is called decentralized identity using certificates. And kind of just, fine, we'll just use basic auth and send it over HTTP. And if anybody complains, they can approve a certificate. Not a great solution, but it was my first taste of like this client server identity attacker model that you have to think through. And I absolutely loved it. And then about 6 months later, there was a job opening inside of Microsoft for the identity team. Didn't really know what it entailed, but I threw my name into the hat. I was ready for something new after 4 years of dev tooling. Went into the interview, and turns out, it was for like, be the person who owns OAuth. I didn't fully understand that, and so I talked about how we really need to get rid of OAuth. It's terrible. We need passkeys instead. Anybody who's listening at this point is going, these things are not, one doesn't replace the other. What are we doing here, kid? But I guess I showed enough potential that they put me into the ring anyways. And so that was how I got an office next to Mike Jones.
That's awesome. So obviously, you've worked with some of the greats, Mike, Vittorio. Have you had, aside from the one you just mentioned, have you had any of those moments where you've been like, what have I done? And what did you learn from those situations?
Oh gosh. I think one of the first things that I was tasked with when I got to Entra, back then Azure AD, was get OIDC compliance, the certificate saying that we're actually compliant with the spec, from the OIDF, because we weren't, which is a little bit embarrassing, right? Like, our names are on the spec, but we haven't filled out the paperwork saying that we're compliant. And so that was a really great crash course in, like, what is this stuff? How is it supposed to work? How does our own product work? And got all the way through the paperwork. Here we pass all of the tests as long as you configure it in exactly this way. Only to realize that, like, well, it's only compliant if you really look at it in this one angle, and we're not fully compliant along, like, the way that most people would actually use this thing, which is, I think, a bit of a trend I've noticed over the years. The first introduction to, oh yeah, there are specs and there's rules about how all of this should work, and, well, everybody kind of follows them. They believe that they're following them. And that was that first moment of, like, realizing I was on the edge of a very steep precipice, looking down, going, "Oh boy, okay, yeah, we're gonna do this."
Yeah.
The first customer call that I got of, "Hey, yeah, you marked yourself as compliant, and, like, none of this is right. Like, what are you doing?" Like, "Mike, help."
We had an interview earlier where we were talking to someone who'd been deeply involved in OAuth, and he's like, and standards in general. And he talked about how, because it's a consensus process, the people who all came into the room would occasionally leave these big gaping train-sized holes in them, given how different vendors, would want to implement things with their own special sauce in that way. And that makes, in some cases, to say you've standardized ish, maybe technically, but then there's this big piece in the middle that's just, and we wing it.
Yeah, the common endpoint for Entra, brilliant idea. I wish it had any semblance to something inside of the spec.
Okay, so that was that bit of it. But at some point, you realized that there was more than the authentication component. There was the authorization side of identity. So, what was your first facepalm moment on that?
I came into GitHub feeling, like hot stuff. Like, yeah, I'm a staff product manager. You hired me for my identity knowledge. I've been doing, the biggest IDP and its protocols for 3.5 years now. I know what authorization is. It's the scopes that you put inside of the access token. And then running immediately face first into, what about all the repos that the user has access to? What are they an admin? You can't put all this stuff into a token. It was really, really obvious on day one. But I was so blinded by that, like, oh yeah, we are the IDP, we emit tokens, we are the source of truth for all things. Well, obviously untrue, right? We're the source of truth for everything that we know about, but not how the rest of the world works. And so, just, like, realizing that there was this whole extra world out there, with terms like OPA, and Zanzibar, and all of the, like, my team when I joined was actually working on trying to rebase GitHub's authorization system onto Zanzibar, through a third-party open source vendor, and just realizing that I had this crash course of, like, oh, figure out the generic concepts of how platforms implement authorization real quick. Made me realize, like, oh, maybe I'm not such hot shit.
That's hilarious. It makes me think about the art and science of things. If you look at cybersecurity, that's my background. There's a good blend of art and science, and even more where I started, which was threat intelligence. There's even more art than there is actual science, in my opinion. From your perspective, when you look at identity, I think there's a lot of art, there's a lot of science, and I think people talk about it. But what is that one art thing about identity that stands out to you, and what is that one science thing that stands out to you?
Yeah, there's definitely this deep interface between, like, technically how does all this stuff work so that it's secure, and then also how does it solve the business problem, right? I'm a PM, so I'll focus on that aspect. But like,
Yeah.
one of the things that we're working on right now is breaking down these really coarse grained, like, you have read or write against your GitHub, right? Like super coarse grained roles that don't really give you a lot of flexibility. And now we're working with everybody at GitHub to break those down into really fine grained permissions. You can open up a pull request, but you can't merge it. That's not a concept that exists. We don't even have that language. And so the art side of that is really understanding what I call like that Goldilocks granularity
Mm-hmm.
of, like, you can have an infinite number of permissions, scopes, whatever you want to call them, and too many makes it useless. Too few makes it insecure. You got to nail the middle ground there, and there's no formula for it. You're not going to math it out. You're going to figure out your customer scenarios and like try to nail the middle ground. And teaching that art to everybody else at GitHub has been really interesting, because it's like, I don't know what you're supposed to do. You got to figure it out, man. Good luck. So definitely art there.
What about the science?
Science. That was the part of identity that I really loved at Microsoft, especially because it was like given not quite infinite building blocks, but like we've got a lot of very specific tools in our tool belt, make it all work together in a secure way.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so mechanical where you can just look at something and say, like, are you validating that token correctly?
Yeah.
Like, there's ironclad rules around this, and being able to build that picture of the full loop of like token issuance, token validation. Are we supporting it? Like, do we have escalation of privilege in any of these scenarios because these permissions don't overlap in the right ways or they do in the wrong ways?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for me, like, that's pure science. That is just, as long as you can keep all the moving parts in your head or get them written out, like, you can prove, yep, that'll work, and that's going to be a problem. Don't build that.
Yeah.
So I love that stuff.
No, I love that. And one thing that, I'm sure you're painfully aware of is that there's always something new happening in identity, a new standard, new technology, new way of implementing or doing things. What is that one thing that stands out to you that when you first, heard about it, whether it's, a vocabulary term or even like a concept that caused you to like scratch your head and say, wait, what is this?
Much love to the folks that come to IATF. The one that I still struggle with was like the rich authorization requests spec. I really want to learn more about it, but every time I hear bits and pieces around the edges around how that stuff's working, just kind of trying to stay up to date on stuff. And I'm mapping that onto what I'm familiar with, and kind of like I mentioned about those blinders of
Right.
not owning anything that's authorization based. When I try to actually map that spec into what it is I'm familiar with, it's another one of those feelings of just like, wait, I don't know what I don't know right here. Like, I got a lot to learn, and figure out how other people do stuff. It just an hour and a half ago, right? I dropped a note into the IDPro channel, Slack, being like, hey, has anybody ever implemented like this pattern before? We need something for it. And I'm half expecting, I saw Aaron reacted to it and I went, oh crap, I have to go look for an OAuth spec, don't I? Like, there's definitely something that already exists here. And sure enough, there is. And, I'm like, 3 people are going to chime in, I'm sure, with like, oh yeah, we've done it this way and you've never seen it before, but hey, there's already tech that does this for you. So that's the excitement of identity, right? It's just like there's always something out there that somebody's done that you can learn from.
One thing about working in an enterprise the size of GitHub or the size of Microsoft is to say there are silos is probably generous, and trying to figure out all the different internal like federation patterns that may have to happen in terms of how this group wants to authenticate or how they want to authorize, or what granularity are they working at. I mean, it really sounds like you're just wrestling this big hydra in a vat of jello, which might have been oddly specific, so I'm just going to move on from that. What's the most absurd or funny challenge that you faced in handling all of this?
The thing about Microsoft is that it, in my mind, it kind of, I'm a like nerd, and so if you're into like,
we don't get those on this podcast.
No, I know. No. Like the very like grim dark techno future of like 40K, if you're familiar, of like the tech priests singing their songs over how does the computers to make them work because they don't actually know what's going on anymore. There were some systems at Microsoft that their identity standards and how they were built like to initially handle stuff like billing. I'm talking Microsoft is going to charge people for software over the internet levels of this is how old it was. I mean, it predates me owning a computer, I think. And not a lot of those systems have changed since they were built. And so it's people that are the like 9th or 10th generation of owners of this code, maybe 15th generation. They don't really know what it does. We don't know what it does, but we're really hoping we can make it work in a way that looks vaguely modern in terms of, operating with stuff that was built in the last 10 years. And just the kind of hopeless, I don't want to say futility, but like the just sheer like, oh my gosh, we have 20 years, 30 years almost of tech debt to get through so that this thing understands a jot. Okay. And just, if you've ever seen like the apocryphal code comments of like, once you're done wasting your time here, like add a number to this comment so that the next person to go up against this can try to be better warned than
part
you
of
were.
The family.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
And so just like the varying ages of platforms where you had fairly new applications that were like super lightweight, super agile. We want to build everything in React and run everything out of the front end. Give us everything in JavaScript. And then the back end that was like, oh, we don't know what tenants are. We just support personal accounts for enterprise payment plans. And trying to glue all of this together into one cohesive system, like it was fantastic, but sometimes it just makes you go, what are we doing here?
I know as you were probably going through the process of learning identity, but then actually having to perform, but not only perform, you're teaching partners, you're talking to colleagues. And I think there's always, at least not always, but I think there are situations where fake it till you make it is super appropriate. But then there's also kind of a concept of like, hey, we're all going to learn this together. What was your approach when you were kind of learning at the same time as teaching? Was it fake it till you make it, or was it more of like a, hey, let's all figure out this stuff together?
Oh, definitely the latter. Because at Microsoft, I like to tell folks that, when I left Microsoft after about 7.5 years, and I left Microsoft, still there technically.
No one leaves Microsoft.
Right, exactly. 7.5 years was like almost enough seniority to like, maybe we should like actually invite this guy to a meeting or something. 10 years was where it was like, oh yeah, maybe we should actually ask them questions.
Yeah.
Because, people have tenure at Microsoft, and they move around a lot, and you'll be talking to random people, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I remember when I worked on that project that you now currently own 12 years ago." Oh, great. So you know more about what we're talking about than I do. So I'm not going to teach you anything. Why don't you start teaching me instead? And so, I would be working with folks in Office or folks in Windows. And the people I was working with on that side had previously worked in identity. So there was absolutely no faking it until you make it, because the risk of somebody that you're talking to at random just being like, I don't think it works that way, because when I wrote the code for that, oh, never mind. So, just keeping that, uh, being humble and always being willing to like learn something new. Um, and especially because at the end of the day, like kind of with all that, the layers of years of accumulating systems,
Mm-hmm.
you are never going to understand what is on the other side of the TCP connection, kind of, and so
For sure.
you just gotta ask more questions and find out more forever.
Mm-hmm. Can agree
Uh,
more.
So I'm hearing a lot about, the wonders of technical debt, the magic of always feeling like the youngest person in the room kind of thing. But there has to be something that makes you keep coming back to this. I mean, I know identity is a very sticky subject. No one ever actually escapes it, but usually there's a story you tell yourself as to why you're letting yourself stay in this business. What is your story? Why do you do this to yourself?
I mean, I love it. And I think it's kind of what you said. It's sticky. You can never escape it, and it's because it's everywhere. Um, it is the start and end kind of your relationship with anything. Nothing works without identity, and so
Mm-hmm.
for me, as somebody who I really just like getting in there and figuring out how stuff works. And that's all identity is, right? Is your partner team comes in, they want to do something weird, and it's like, okay, let's just start at the beginning of anything that you could possibly want to do and work all the way through it to figure out what it is that you actually need from us.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, being an identity at Microsoft was awesome because uh, you had to work with every single team and every single product at Microsoft. So I would go from meeting with Xbox to meeting with HoloLens to meeting with uh, Power BI and Power Tools, like in a single day, and just knowing what everybody is doing and kind of like from a nosy perspective, kind of getting to just be like, hey, what are you doing over there? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Can you give me access to that? That's cool. So like, hey, we're gonna talk to Minecraft today. We're gonna like you have access to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you can say you're in the middle of everything or you're underneath everything. Um, and it's fantastic. Like that plus the fun problems that you always have to solve, that never get old. Plus, and this is the kind of prideful piece of it. Um, when you've seen enough of it and you can start saying, oh, these patterns kind of line up. Somebody else has done this before. You get to start doing the psychic debugging
Hmm.
and just like, oh yeah, based off of this, yeah, they're not doing the X, Y, and Z correctly. It's just like, how do you
I like that psychic debugging.
know that? Oh yeah.
So I don't know about you. It's when you're in that position of being able to connect so many disparate parts, or at least what look like disparate parts when you're on the outside looking in, but when you're on the inside, you're like, yeah, no, you're doing this and you're doing this and you're doing this, right? You get a very different perspective on what it is that you personally do for a living. Now, when my mother tries to describe what I do for a living, she's pretty much settled on, yeah, my daughter, I think she's an international spy that works in tech. It's about as far as she's ever gotten with it because I can't. She doesn't understand what it is I do, and I suspect you've encountered the same kind of thing. People that just they don't understand what it is you do. So, what would you say is the one thing people outside of the identity industry get completely wrong about the field, or conversely, what is it that the insiders just overthink like crazy?
Spicy. So I think from the outside looking in, it's that it's just authentication and it's just authorization. Um, yeah, what fool thinks that identity is just authentication? But the authorization piece in particular, authentication is pretty easy to like carve out, and it sits on the side and it's pretty well isolated. But the authorization piece, what I've learned, especially being at GitHub, is that in a lot of ways, if you want a good authorization system, you sort of have to be the type system for the company. And that wasn't something I appreciated until we were sitting inside of GitHub trying to build these easy to use, kind of automatically supported authorization patterns, so that we weren't building every single new thing from scratch every single time, where it's like, oh, I want to be an owner of an issue, so let's build the issues ownership system. And then I want to be an owner of a package, so we'll build the package ownership system. It's like, no. GitHub has objects and you want to own an object, so we will build the object ownership system. And this might be the like GitHub's built in Ruby, so it doesn't have types or anything. Like there's something there. But having authorization be the spine, in a sense, of your data model for the entire company. Mm-hmm. Because like if you have things, you need a way of figuring out who can access them. And if all of your things are disparate and unrelated to one another, it's going to be a lot harder to figure that out.
Yep.
So kind of forcing that organization into the rest of the platform is something that I don't think gets appreciated as much, but that also might be unique to what I'm trying to get done.
Before we close out, I got to ask you this question. If you had a time machine and you could go back to the very beginning when you started your identity journey, what is that piece of advice that you would give yourself? And bonus point, if you can think about a piece of advice that you would even give yourself today, and it can't be that you would tell them to not try to replace OAuth with passkeys.
I think get out there more often. I learned so much by, going to IETF, hanging out in the IDPro Slack, going to Authenticate, just sitting at OSW or presenting at OSW and getting ripped to shreds by Vittorio, in a very loving way, of course.
It was a rite of passage.
Yep. And he goes, right. Surprise. But those blinders that I talked about, like, I'm sure I still have them. And so, like, get out of my comfort zone, go talk to other professionals, go figure out how other people do this stuff. It's not enough to just talk to my customers about how they use my thing. It's go figure out like radically new ways of doing stuff. Maybe I would have learned that authorization existed for real if I had like talked to anybody and been a bit more curious. And the same thing's true now. Like, just sit in front of as many people as possible, hear about how their stuff works, and like, yeah, keep learning.
Love it. Well said. Well said. Hirsch, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for taking time out of your busy schedule to hop on the mics with us. Thank you to AKA Identity and IDPro. Be sure to check out IDPro to be a member, and especially if you want to get your whole organization caught up with all things identity, join as a corporate member. And thank you to all of you that are watching Heather and I take this exploration of identity experts and the field of identity. And with that, we will see everyone next time.